catchphrase is?
You probably do. A catchphrase is basically just a popular phrase.
Now, sometimes we get catchphrases from celebrities or movies or pop songs. Do you know who these catchphrases belong to? On fleek.
That would be Nicki Minaj. How about this one? I'm taking my talents to South Beach.
Ah, that's the other King James. LeBron. Look, here's another one. Shake it off.
I think my grandmother would get this one. The answer is Taylor Swift, for those of you who live in a hole. And finally, you're fired.
Oh, well, of course, that would be the Don, Donald Trump. And, then there are catchphrases that don't really belong to anyone in particular. They're just things we all say, like selfie or squad goals. I can't even. Throwing shade.
Beast mode, Throwback Thursday, whippin' nay nay. I've even heard of hit the quan. And actually, I have no idea what that one is.
Now, even if you don't know all of those catchphrases, you probably recognized a few. And when you go to school or hang out with your friends and you hear people using catchphrases like these, it's usually easy to know what they're talking about.
We all know what a selfie is. We know what Shake It Off is all about. When we get on Instagram, we know that Throwback Thursdays only happen on Thursdays. But imagine that you just showed up on planet Earth for the very first time and heard some of these catchphrases in conversation. Imagine that you had absolutely no context.
You'd spend a lot of time trying to decipher things like TBT, TBH, and IRL. You'd wonder how everyone knew the same songs and dance moves. You'd wish people would actually finish their sentences once in a while because they can't even. I mean, what? Can you picture it? You probably feel like you were speaking a completely different language. You'd wish someone would just explain all of these weird new phrases to you.
This kind of thing happens at church too, doesn't it? There are phrases that are just church phrases that people who go to church use all the time. If you come to church a lot, you may not even think about it. But if you're new to church, you might hear these phrases and think, everyone tosses these words around, but what do they even mean? Maybe when you walk into church, you feel like you're speaking a completely different language.
Can anyone relate to that? Here's a phrase you'll hear a lot in church. Jesus saves. Has anyone heard that catchphrase before?
Or maybe you've heard it said another way, like, I want to be saved, or are you saved, or if you want to be saved. But what does saved actually mean? When we say words like saved or salvation at church, what are we talking about?
Basically, salvation means being rescued from something. Maybe you've even heard it said that you've been saved from hell or saved from sin. Now, we tend to use the word when we talk about praying a prayer or about a time when we made a decision to follow Jesus, maybe at a retreat or at church or when we were little kids with our parents. We talk about a moment when we said some words and poof, Jesus saved us.
I remember being 5 or 6 years old and sitting on the bed with my mom. And I remember wanting to ask Jesus into my heart and for him to come in and save me from my sins. So my mom sat there with me and prayed with me on the bed. And that was a huge moment in my life. Obviously, I still remember it. But sometimes I've made the mistake of thinking that one moment was all that mattered.
When we think about it that way, salvation or being saved is really just something that happens one time, and we kind of put it out of our mind. It's like we put a check beside that item on our list. Like, saved. Yep. Been there, done that. Now we can do whatever we want because we've already been saved.
After that, salvation isn't really something we think about. It matters that we did it, but it doesn't have a lot of meaning now for our everyday lives.
But what if we've been all wrong about this phrase? What if we're missing out on something much bigger than we ever imagined when it comes to being saved by Jesus?
We're going to look at the book of Philippians in the Bible, where the Apostle Paul talks about this same idea. Paul is the guy who wrote a lot of the New Testament and spent most of his life traveling around the world and telling people about Jesus.
Paul says, "Therefore, my dear friends, as you have always obeyed, not only in my presence, but now much more in my absence, continue to work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose."
Did you catch what he said? Continue to work out your salvation. Paul is saying salvation isn't just something that happened one time, a long time ago when you were a kid, or last summer when you went to camp. Paul seems to suggest that salvation is more than a one-time event. It's something that continues.
Salvation, according to Paul, is something you continue to work on today, tomorrow, for the rest of your life. Now, that doesn't mean if you prayed that prayer, something special didn't happen in that moment.
Salvation is saving us from our sin and our brokenness. When we accept that Jesus took the punishment for our sins on the cross, God forgives us immediately of all of our sins. And God gives us Jesus' perfectly clean record.
But that doesn't mean we don't sin anymore. It just means our sins don't get to decide who we are. God does. And when Jesus saves us, God declares us forgiven and clean. Our sin no longer has the power to call the shots in our lives.
Salvation is being saved from the power sin had over us. Salvation says that what Jesus did for us when he died is the most important thing now. We are defined by who Jesus says we are. That's what happens in a salvation moment. But that's not the end of the story. Salvation is more than a one-time event. It's more than a moment. But how? What does salvation mean for our lives every day afterward?
Have you ever gotten a really nasty cut, scraped your knee or your elbow? Well, chances are when that happened, your mom went to the medicine cabinet and got some Neosporin. But Neosporin is a salve. A salve is a thing you use to help something heal and be made whole again. That word salve comes from the same Latin root word where we get our English word salvation. See, when Paul talks about us working out this salvation, when he talks about something we're saved for, he's talking about this idea of healing.
God can save us in a moment, but he wants to heal us too. He wants us to be who he intends for us to be. He wants us to be made whole, and that takes time and healing. So we can be saved in a moment, but we continue being saved when we let God heal us and make us whole every day afterward. Healing us from shame when we make a wrong choice.
Healing from the distance sin creates between us and God and us and others. Healing from the bitterness we have towards people who have hurt us. That's a process, not a one-time event. It's supposed to take time. Salvation is growing into who Jesus has said we are and learning to let our life look like what Jesus said it could be.
Remember how Paul wrote, "For it is God who works in you to will and to act in order to fulfill his good purpose." That's part of the good purpose God has for you and for me, to be healed, to be whole. The story of salvation may have started with a moment, but it's a story that keeps going every day from here on out.
Maybe you never really thought of the word salvation before, at all. But maybe this makes sense to you. If that's you, talk to your small group leader. Begin by making a decision tonight to follow Jesus and start the process of allowing God to heal you.
Or maybe you've prayed the prayer and made a commitment to follow Jesus a long time ago and you thought that meant you were good, but nothing has changed. Your life doesn't look any different.
Well, maybe that's because you haven't started to take the time to begin the healing part of salvation. Make a decision today to begin working out and living out your salvation now. God has so much more for you than just an insurance policy on where you go after you die. He doesn't just want to save you someday.
He wants to save you now and continue saving you tomorrow and the day after that and every day after. He wants you healed. He wants you whole because God knows the salvation that heals is his salvation. This happens to you when you see that salvation is more than a moment.